The sentence that changed Elvis's life forever came from the mouth of a 7-year-old child. Memphis, Tennessee, August 16, 1977, exactly 1 year before Elvis would leave this world. The king of rock and roll was in the middle of his most emotionally charged performance when something happened that no one in that arena would ever forget. Elvis stopped mid-song, walked to the edge of the stage, and did something that broke every rule of live performance. What that little boy whispered to him next would haunt Elvis's heart for the rest of his life. But to understand why this moment shattered the man who had everything, we need to go back to where it all began, 3 hours before the show, in the shadows behind the greatest stage in rock and roll history. The Mid-South Coliseum was buzzing with anticipation that August evening. 15,000 fans had packed into the arena, many traveling hundreds of miles just to see Elvis perform. The air was thick with excitement, cigarette smoke, and the kind of electric energy that only surrounded an Elvis Presley concert. Backstage, Elvis was going through his pre-show ritual. At 42 years old, the king was still magnetic, still powerful, but those closest to him could see the weight he carried. The jumpsuit that once fit perfectly now strained against a frame that bore the burden of decades of fame, prescription medications, and the crushing loneliness that comes with being the most famous man in the world. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, was pacing nervously in the hallway. Ticket sales had been slower than expected, and there were whispers in the industry that Elvis was losing his touch. Some critics were calling him a has-been, a relic of a bygone era trying desperately to recapture his youth. But in dressing room A, Elvis wasn't thinking about critics or ticket sales. He was staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. Written in a child's handwriting, with crayon drawings in the margins. The letter was from a 7-year-old boy named Tommy, whose mother had written to explain that her son was fighting leukemia. Tommy's dying wish was to see Elvis perform, and somehow, this letter had made its way past all the handlers and security to land directly in Elvis's hands. Elvis set the letter down, walked to his mirror, and for a moment, the mask of the king fell away. What he saw looking back at him was a man questioning everything he had become. Dr. Nikopoulos knocked on the door. Elvis, 15 minutes to showtime. But Elvis wasn't listening. He was thinking about another little boy, himself at 7 years old, growing up poor in Tupelo, when music was pure magic, before the world got complicated, before fame became a prison. He picked up the letter again. Tommy's mother had written that they couldn't afford tickets, but they would be listening on the radio, hoping somehow Elvis would know they were out there. Elvis folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jumpsuit pocket, right over his heart. The arena erupted as Elvis took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. The roar was deafening. 15,000 people rose to their feet as one, their voices creating a wall of sound that could be heard for blocks. Elvis grabbed the microphone, his presence commanding every eye in the building. He opened with "C.C. Rider," his voice still powerful, still capable of making grown women weep and strong men feel like children again. But something was different tonight. Those who knew Elvis well, his band, his backup singers, could sense it. There was a raw emotion in his voice that went beyond performance. 3 songs in, during "Love Me Tender," Elvis noticed something that made his heart stop. In the front row, pressed against the security barrier, was a small figure. A little boy, maybe 7 years old, wearing a homemade Elvis t-shirt and holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "I love you Elvis." The child's face was pale, too pale, and Elvis recognized the telltale signs of illness that no child should have to bear. The song died in Elvis's throat. He stopped singing mid-verse, and the entire arena fell into confused silence. 15,000 people watched as Elvis Presley, the man who commanded stages around the world, stood frozen, staring at one small boy. The band kept playing for a few more bars before gradually stopping, unsure what was happening. Elvis's backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations, exchanged worried glances. In the audience, whispers rippled through the crowd. What's happening? Why did he stop? Is Elvis okay? But Elvis only had eyes for the boy. Without a word, he walked to the edge of the stage and knelt down. Security guards moved to intervene, but Elvis waved them back with a gesture that brooked no argument. He was reaching down toward the child, and everyone in the arena held their breath. "Hey there, little man," Elvis said softly, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying through the vast space. "What's your name?" The boy looked up with wide eyes, not quite believing that his hero was talking to him. "Tommy," he whispered. Elvis felt his heart skip. This was the boy from the letter. Somehow, against all odds, Tommy and his mother had made it to the show. Elvis later learned that a local radio station had heard the story and bought them tickets, but in that moment, all he knew was that this brave little boy was right in front of him. "Tommy," Elvis repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I got your letter, son." The boy's eyes went wide. "You did? Really? Really? And you know what? I've been thinking about you all day." Elvis reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter, now slightly crumpled from being close to his heart. "This letter right here, it reminded me of something important. Subscribe now and leave a comment. You're about to witness the most heartbreaking moment in rock and roll history." Elvis looked at Tommy's mother, who was crying silently behind her son. He could see the pain in her eyes, the fear, the desperate hope that this moment might somehow be magic enough to heal what medicine couldn't cure. Elvis had seen that look before, in his own mother's eyes when she was sick, in the mirrors of hospital rooms he'd visited over the years. "Tommy, I want to ask you something," Elvis said, his voice carrying across the silent arena. "Would you like to come up here with me?" The crowd gasped. In all his years of performing, Elvis had never brought a child on stage during a concert. It broke every security protocol, every rule that management had set. But Elvis didn't care about rules anymore. Tommy nodded eagerly, and security guards helped lift the small boy onto the stage. As Tommy stood beside him, Elvis noticed how thin the child was, how the homemade t-shirt hung loose on his tiny frame. But Tommy's eyes were bright with excitement, and his smile could have lit up the entire arena. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced to the crowd, his arm around Tommy's shoulders, "I want you to meet my friend Tommy. He's 7 years old, and he's the bravest person I know." The crowd erupted in applause, but Elvis held up his hand for silence. He knelt down again so he was at Tommy's eye level, and what happened next would echo through the years as one of the most powerful moments in rock and roll history. "Tommy," Elvis said quietly, but the microphone picked up every word, "I want you to know something. You're stronger than any superhero, braver than any soldier, and more important to me than any song I've ever sung." The little boy looked up at Elvis with pure adoration and said, in a voice that was small but clear, "Elvis, when I get to heaven, will you teach me to sing like you?" The question hit Elvis like a physical blow. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, was preparing for a journey that no 7-year-old should have to contemplate. And in his pure, simple faith, he was already planning for what came next. Elvis felt tears spring to his eyes, not the tears of a performer, but the tears of a man confronting the deepest truths about life and love and loss. The arena had gone completely silent. 15,000 people witnessed Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, break down and cry in front of a dying child. "Tommy," Elvis said, his voice breaking, "if there's singing in heaven, son, you're going to be teaching me." The little boy smiled and hugged Elvis around the neck. In that moment, something profound shifted in Elvis's heart. All the fame, all the money, all the adulation from millions of fans around the world, none of it mattered compared to this one perfect moment with this brave little boy. Elvis stood up, Tommy still in his arms, and turned to face the crowd. "Folks, I want you to do something for me. I want you to sing with Tommy and me. This song is for every child who's fighting a battle they shouldn't have to fight, and for every parent who's watching their child be braver than they ever thought possible." What happened next was magic. Elvis began singing, "He touched me, but he changed the words, making it a song about Tommy's courage, about the strength that comes from love, about the way children can teach adults what really matters in life. His voice, rich and full of emotion, filled the arena, but it was joined by 15,000 other voices, all singing for Tommy, all connected in a moment of pure human love. Tommy joined in too, his small voice barely audible but somehow audible to everyone there. Elvis gave the boy his microphone, and Tommy sang a few lines on his own, his pure, untrained voice bringing tears to eyes throughout the arena. But here's the incredible part of this story. The part nobody expected. As the song reached its crescendo, Elvis did something unprecedented. He took off his cape, the iconic cape that was worth thousands of dollars, that was part of his stage persona, that represented everything he was as a performer. He wrapped it around Tommy's small shoulders. "This belongs to you now," Elvis whispered into the microphone. "You're the real king here tonight." Tommy looked down at the cape, which dragged on the ground. It was so big for him, and then looked back up at Elvis with wonder. "But Elvis, what will you wear?" Elvis smiled through his tears. "Son, I've got everything I need right here," he said, pointing to his heart. "But you take that cape, and when you wear it, you remember that you taught Elvis Presley what it really means to be brave." The crowd was sobbing. Grown men were crying openly. Women were holding each other, overcome with emotion. This wasn't just a concert anymore, it was a moment of pure human connection, the kind that transcends entertainment and becomes something sacred. Elvis carried Tommy to the edge of the stage and carefully handed him back to his mother, who was crying so hard she could barely stand. He knelt down one more time and whispered something in Tommy's ear that no microphone picked up, something private between them. Then Elvis stood up, looked out at the audience, and said simply, "Let's sing some more. Share this story and subscribe, make this moment unforgettable." The rest of the concert was unlike anything anyone had ever seen Elvis perform. He sang with a passion and vulnerability that stripped away all pretense. Songs that had been in his repertoire for years suddenly had new meaning. "Love Me Tender" became a lullaby for Tommy. "Can't Help Falling in Love" became a promise to treasure every moment of connection. "How Great Thou Art" became a prayer for healing and hope. But it was during the encore that the most magical moment happened. As Elvis was finishing "My Way," Tommy's small voice could be heard from the front row, singing along with every word. Elvis heard it, stopped the band, and had the spotlight turned on Tommy, still wearing the cape and still singing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced, "the future king of rock and roll." Tommy waved from the audience, and the entire arena erupted in the longest standing ovation in the Coliseum's history. Elvis bowed deeply toward Tommy, a gesture of respect from one performer to another, from one human being to another who had taught him something profound about courage. After the show, Elvis went directly to find Tommy and his mother. They spent an hour together backstage, just talking. Elvis listened as Tommy told him about his treatments, about his dreams, about his favorite songs. Before they left, Elvis gave Tommy his personal guitar. "Every king needs his instrument," Elvis said. "Promise me you'll keep playing, no matter what happens." Tommy promised. And for the next 3 months, until his battle with leukemia finally ended, Tommy played that guitar every day. But the story doesn't end there. Because what Tommy gave Elvis that night changed the king forever. In the final year of Elvis's life, he carried that letter with him everywhere. His friends and family noticed a change in him. He was more present, more connected to the people around him. He started visiting children's hospitals regularly, always in secret, never for publicity. He would bring his guitar and sing for sick children, always remembering what Tommy had taught him about real courage. Elvis's final performance, just weeks before his death, ended with him dedicating the last song to "all the brave children who teach us adults what love really means." Those who were there said he looked directly into the camera when he said it, as if he was speaking to Tommy wherever he was. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, exactly 1 year after that magical night with Tommy, his friends found the crumpled letter in his bedroom, still folded carefully, still close to his heart. Next to it was a photo from that concert, showing Elvis and Tommy on stage together, both of them smiling, both of them touched by a moment that transcended fame and became something eternal. Tommy's mother kept Elvis's cape and guitar. Years later, when she donated them to Graceland, she included a note, "These belong to Elvis, but Tommy taught him they belong to anyone brave enough to love without limits." Elvis learned that being a king isn't about the crown you wear. It's about the hearts you touch. Today, visitors to Graceland can see Tommy's photo in a special exhibit about Elvis's humanitarian work. The caption reads simply, "Tommy, age 7, who taught the king what courage really means." But perhaps the most beautiful legacy of that night is what it represents, the moment when Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer in the world, learned that true greatness isn't measured in record sales or sold-out concerts, but in the ability to see the sacred in the simple, the profound in the innocent, and the eternal in a single moment of genuine human connection. The cape that Elvis wrapped around Tommy's shoulders that night still carries the power to move people to tears. Not because it belonged to Elvis, but because it represents the moment when love conquered fame, when humanity triumphed over celebrity, when a dying child taught a superstar what it truly means to live. That's the real magic of Elvis Presley. Not just his voice or his moves or his charisma, but his capacity to be transformed by love, to be humbled by courage, and to recognize that sometimes the most important lessons come from the smallest teachers. Subscribe, share, and keep this story alive. Because in a world that often forgets what really matters, we all need to remember Tommy, and we all need to remember the night Elvis Presley learned that being touched by grace is more important than being touched by fame.